The crimson sunset bled across the Arizona sky, casting long shadows as I pulled into my driveway. I'd been gone for 3 weeks, locked in confidential meetings about my new role. Yet, the picturesque scene was ruined by a single glaring detail: a fluorescent orange piece of paper flapping on my garage door. My stomach clenched. This had to be the work of the infamous HOA president. In the 6 months since I'd moved in, our 2 brief encounters had been enough to confirm her reputation. She ruled our neighborhood like a personal fiefdom. The first meeting involved a lecture about my grass being half an inch too long. The second, her husband meticulously measuring the distance between my mailbox and the curb down to the 16th of an inch. Now, this. My hands trembled with a mix of fury and disbelief as I ripped the notice off the door. Violation. Unauthorized vehicle storage. It blared in bold, official-looking font. Remove motorcycle within 48 hours or face immediate towing and fines. Below, in the HOA president's impeccable, looping handwriting, motorcycles reduce property values and attract an undesirable element to our community. I stared at my pristine 2023 Harley-Davidson Road Glide, a machine that cost more than the HOA president's luxury SUV. I'd spent countless weekends meticulously washing and polishing it in my driveway, even teaching some of the neighborhood kids about motorcycle maintenance. Old Mr. Jones from next door often brought his grandson over, their eyes wide with admiration. Just then, the HOA president power walked past, clad in designer workout gear, her perfectly coiffed, blonde hair barely moving. No wave, no acknowledgement, just a pointed, disdainful glance at my bike and a tap on her $500 smartwatch. The message was clear. The clock was ticking. My first instinct was to chase her down, to explain that I wasn't just some biker. I was about to be announced as the new CEO of Harley-Davidson. The press release was scheduled for next week, but something, a gut feeling, a sense of impending justice, told me to wait, to document. I pulled out my phone, snapping pictures of the bike, the notice, the spotless condition of my property. As I was photographing, another neighbor, a man named Robert, emerged to water his lawn. Robert was the HOA president's right-hand man on the board, always echoing her ridiculous pronouncements. "Shame about that bike," Robert called out, his voice dripping with false sympathy. "Rules are rules." My gaze shifted to his driveway. There, gleaming under the fading sunlight, was a brand-new tow truck. Peterson's Towing, the freshly painted logo proclaimed. A knot formed in my stomach. This wasn't about property values or community standards. This was something far more calculated. Inside, I fired up my laptop and dove into the HOA documents. 3 hours and 2 mugs of strong coffee later, I still couldn't find a single bylaw specifically banning motorcycles. But I did find something intriguing. Every vehicle towed in the past year had been hauled away by Peterson's Towing, and the fees were suspiciously high. My phone buzzed with another HOA email. "Emergency board meeting, tomorrow, vehicle policy updates." The timing was far too convenient. As I watched the last sliver of sun disappear below the horizon, I saw the HOA president and Robert huddled in her driveway, their gazes fixed on my garage. A slow smile spread across my face. They had no idea who they were dealing with, but they were about to find out. Sometimes the biggest mistakes come from judging a book by its cover, or, in this case, judging a CEO by his motorcycle. I had 48 hours to stop them, and a plan was already taking shape. The pre-dawn darkness was shattered by my security camera's alert. Through my bedroom window, I watched in stunned disbelief as a blue tow truck backed into my driveway. My heart hammered against my ribs as I threw on clothes and raced downstairs, but it was too late. My beloved Harley was already chained up, disappearing down the street. The truck's logo, Peterson's Towing, was seared into my memory. I leaped into my car, giving chase, but the truck vanished around a corner. My phone buzzed again. A text from the HOA president. Per HOA regulations, unauthorized vehicle has been removed. Office hours at 9 a.m. It was barely 6 a.m. She'd planned this meticulously. At precisely 9 a.m., I strode into the HOA office, fighting to maintain a calm exterior. The HOA president sat behind her desk, a queen on her throne, her signature pearl necklace gleaming, a smug smile playing on her lips. Robert lounged in a corner chair, fiddling with his tow truck keys. "Mr. Zeese," the HOA president said, not even bothering to look up from her computer, "I have your paperwork right here." She slid a folder across the desk. Inside was a copy of some obscure HOA rule about recreational vehicles that I'd never seen before, highlighted in bright yellow. "This is ridiculous," I said, my voice steady despite the rage simmering beneath. "That bike is worth more than your annual salary. You can't just take it." The HOA president finally looked up, adjusting her designer glasses. "Actually, we can. Article 7, Section 12, clearly states that no recreational vehicles may be stored in driveways. You were given notice." "A notice you posted while I was away on business," I retorted. Robert snickered from his corner. "Rules are rules." The HOA president's voice dripped with saccharine sweetness. "We take property values very seriously here. Some of us can't afford to live in neighborhoods with motorcycles everywhere," she said, spitting out the word motorcycles as if it were poison. What she didn't know was that I was about to be named CEO of Harley-Davidson. The news wouldn't be public for another week. Some final paperwork with the board was still being finalized. I could have told her right then, watched her smug expression crumble. But again, that gut feeling told me to wait. "Where's my bike?" I asked instead. "Safe at Peterson's impound lot," Robert chimed in, a predatory grin spreading across his face. "Standard retrieval fee is $500, cash only." I pulled out my phone and began taking pictures of the documents. The HOA president's smile flickered. "Photography isn't allowed in the office," she snapped. "Interesting rule," I said, my voice laced with sarcasm. "Is that written down somewhere too?" As I walked out, I heard them whispering. Glancing back through the glass door, I saw Robert slip something into the HOA president's desk drawer. And then I noticed it. The security camera in the corner of the office. I had a strong suspicion those tapes might reveal some very interesting conversations. Back in my car, I examined the paperwork more closely. The HOA rule they'd cited had a revision date from just last month. Suspiciously convenient. Even more suspicious, the tow company's address matched a property Robert had purchased last year, right after becoming the HOA president's special advisor for community enforcement. My phone buzzed again. Another text from the HOA president. "Impound fees increase by $100 daily. Better hurry." A slow smile spread across my face. I thought about the press conference scheduled for next week. Sometimes the best revenge is simply letting people dig their own graves. I just needed to wait and watch the HOA president and Robert dig a little deeper. Sleep was impossible that night. The image of my stolen Harley haunted me. At 3 a.m., fueled by adrenaline and black coffee, I started digging through the HOA website. Something about that bylaw the HOA president had quoted felt off. 20 minutes and 4 mugs of coffee later, I found it. A complete archive of HOA rules dating back 15 years. My hands started to shake. The motorcycle rule the HOA president had used, It had never been formally approved by the board. She'd simply inserted it into the website 3 months ago, right after Tom Peterson's towing company secured the HOA contract. Speaking of Tom, I remembered something peculiar about his company's name, Peterson's Premium Towing Service, LLC. I pulled up the State Business Registry website. Tom's company had been registered just 4 months ago. Even stranger, it shared an address with the HOA president's personal real estate office. The rabbit hole went deeper. I unearthed every HOA financial record I could find. In the past 3 months, Peterson's Towing had been paid a staggering $47,000 for community services. That seemed like an exorbitant amount of towing for our small, quiet neighborhood. My neighbor, Sarah, who worked at the county clerk's office, had once mentioned that HOA records were public information. At 8 a.m. sharp, I was waiting outside her office door. What she helped me uncover made my jaw drop. The HOA president had changed our HOA's banking arrangements 6 months ago, moving all our accounts to a small, local bank. And guess who sat on that bank's board of directors? Tom Peterson. But the real bombshell came when Sarah pulled up property records. Tom Peterson didn't just own the towing company. His wife owned the storage lot where the towed vehicles were kept. And the cherry on top? They were charging storage fees that were 3 times the legal limit under state law. I took a break, stepping outside for some fresh air, and that's when I saw them. The HOA president and Tom, having lunch at the cafe across the street from the clerk's office. They were laughing, probably congratulating themselves on their clever scheme. The HOA president was waving around a piece of paper that looked suspiciously like another violation notice. Through the window, I could see Tom scribbling something in a small notebook. Back in the clerk's office, I found one final document that made everything click into place. The HOA president had sent out a notice last week announcing a new community improvement fee on all homeowners, supposedly to pay for enhanced security. The amount? It exactly matched the inflated storage fees charged by Tom's company. I carefully gathered all the documents, making sure Sarah certified each copy. As I walked to my car, I spotted a familiar tow truck driving by. One of Tom's. The driver didn't recognize me, but I recognized him. It was the HOA president's son, who she'd claimed was away at college. I snapped a quick photo with my phone. That night, my home office looked like a scene from a detective movie. Papers strewn everywhere. Post-it notes connecting the dots. My phone buzzed. A text from the HOA president. "Hope you're not too upset about the bike, just following the rules." Little did she know, I'd just finished scanning all my evidence and sending it to my legal team at Harley-Davidson. The real question was, how would she look in orange? Because prison jumpsuits might very well be in her future. My hands were steady as I signed the certified letter, formally revealing my identity as Harley-Davidson's CEO. The timing wasn't ideal. We hadn't publicly announced my position yet, but the HOA president's illegal towing racket had pushed me over the edge. I'd spent the weekend gathering stories from other neighbors who'd fallen victim to Peterson's towing. The Jacksons had lost their vintage Mustang. The Garcias' restored Triumph motorcycle had vanished while they were on vacation. Even old Mrs. Chen's grandson had had his first car towed during a family dinner. Each story fueled my anger, but I kept my cool. Then, my assistant Maria burst into my home office with breaking news. The HOA president was planning to auction off all the abandoned vehicles this weekend. My bike would be sold to the highest bidder unless I paid thousands in fabricated fees. She'd sent the notice to my old business address, probably hoping I wouldn't see it in time. I picked up my phone and dialed Ray Martinez, president of the State Motorcycle Rights Association. Ray, remember when I helped fight that unfair helmet law last year? I need a favor. Within an hour, my email inbox was flooded with messages from motorcycle clubs across the state. They were furious about the HOA's discriminatory policies targeting bikes. The HOA president's response to my letter arrived faster than I expected. A uniformed courier handed me an envelope containing a bill for $400 in towing and storage fees, along with a note written in her perfect cursive, "Rules are rules, Mr. Z's. Payment required within 24 hours, or vehicle will be considered abandoned." That's when I noticed something odd about the bill. The letterhead matched other documents I'd seen from Peterson's Towing, but the bank account number was different. A quick search revealed it belonged to an LLC registered to the HOA president's husband. They weren't just towing vehicles, they were running a full-scale scam. I stayed up late, piecing together the final details. Property records showed the HOA president had purchased 3 houses in our neighborhood for well below market value, all from families whose vehicles had been towed. The Garcias had been forced to move away after the towing fees bankrupted them. The pattern was clear: target, harass, collect fees, force sales. At midnight, my doorbell rang. It was Kevin Chen, Mrs. Chen's grandson. "Mr. Zees, I work at the courthouse records department. You need to see this." He handed me a stack of papers, dozens of vehicle auction records, all conducted without proper notice or permits. The HOA president and Tom hadn't just taken my bike, they'd stolen millions in property from our neighbors over the years. I picked up my phone again, this time calling Jane Wong, our local news investigative reporter. "Jane, remember that tip I promised you about corruption in local housing? It's time." I also sent emails to every HOA board member except the HOA president and Tom, attaching the evidence of their scheme. The storm was about to break. But first, I had a rally to plan. Just before dawn, I received an anonymous text. "Auction moved up. Tomorrow, 9 a.m. They were trying to sell my bike before I could expose them. But as I watched the sunrise paint the sky over our quiet streets, a smile crept across my face. The HOA president had no idea what was coming. The distant rumble of engines told me the cavalry was already on its way. Saturday morning dawned crisp and clear. As I sipped my coffee on the front porch, the tranquility was deceptive. At precisely 8 a.m., the distant rumble of motorcycles shattered the suburban peace. The HOA president was already outside, in her pink bathrobe, watering her prized roses, when the first wave of riders turned onto our street. They came in waves: cruisers, sport bikes, vintage models, all impeccably maintained. The Veterans Motorcycle Club led the procession, followed by the Ladies of Chrome, the Classic Riders Association, and dozens more groups. Each rider wore a bright yellow vest with "Anti-Discrimination Rally" printed on the back. I'd made sure every single bike met noise regulations and was street legal. The HOA president's garden hose dropped to the ground as she watched, bewildered, as hundreds of motorcycles filled every legal parking space on our streets. Her perfectly styled hair was still in curlers as she frantically dialed her phone. Tom, get over here now," she shrieked. But Tom Peterson was busy dealing with the news van that had just pulled up in front of his towing company. I walked over to the HOA president, keeping my voice calm and professional. "Beautiful morning for a community gathering, isn't it?" I said, handing her a thick envelope. Inside was a cease and desist letter from my legal team, along with photographs of every illegal tow her friend Tom had performed in the last year. "You can't do this," she sputtered, mascara running down her face. "This is a quiet neighborhood. We have rules." Just then, Mrs. Chen from across the street approached, carrying a tray of cookies. "Actually, Margaret," she said sweetly, "we checked the bylaws. There's nothing against organized community events." Behind her, the Rodriguez family was setting up a lemonade stand for the riders. Even old Mr. Jones, who usually complained about everything, was in his garage, proudly showing off his restored 1950 Harley-Davidson to a group of captivated riders. The HOA president's face turned a shade of purple I'd never seen before as she saw more neighbors emerging to join the rally. The Williams kids were receiving motorcycle safety lessons in the cul-de-sac from certified instructors I'd brought in. The Patels were photographing every bike for their son's school project about different engine types. "I'm calling the police," the HOA president threatened, her hand trembling as she dialed 911. I smiled and pointed to where Officer Rivera was already parked. He waved back, accepting a cookie from Mrs. Chen. "Already taken care of," I said. "We have all the proper permits. And speaking of the police, they're very interested in those kickbacks you've been receiving from Tom's towing company." The color drained from the HOA president's face as she saw another vehicle pull up, a forensic accountant from the district attorney's office. She'd brought boxes of HOA financial records I'd subpoenaed last week. "This isn't over," the HOA president hissed, turning to storm back into her house. But she stopped short. Parked in my driveway was my original Harley, returned and meticulously detailed with a large sign reading, "Protected by the U.S. Constitution and the CEO of Harley-Davidson." As the HOA president slammed her door, the sound was drowned out by hundreds of riders revving their engines in perfect unison. Mrs. Chen handed me a cookie and smiled. "Best Saturday morning ever," she said. I couldn't help but agree. I watched our neighborhood transform, seemingly in an instant, from a place of fear and suspicion into a true community. The morning had begun with a single news van pulling up to cover our motorcycle rally. By noon, there were 5 different TV stations parked outside our community gates. I watched the HOA president pacing in her front yard, phone glued to her ear, as the first reporter approached me with a microphone. "Mr. Zeese, can you tell us about the HOA's towing practices?" the reporter asked. I smiled, reached into my briefcase, and pulled out a thick blue folder our forensic accountant had prepared. "I think these documents will interest you more than my motorcycle," I said, opening it to the first page. For the past 3 years, Peterson's Towing has removed 68 vehicles from our neighborhood. Strangely, every single one of those tows happened within 24 hours of residents questioning HOA fees. The reporter's eyes widened as she flipped through bank statements showing suspicious transfers between the HOA account and an offshore company. Tom Peterson, who'd been lurking behind his curtains, suddenly burst out of his house. "You can't prove anything," he shouted, but his face went ashen when I produced more papers. "Actually, we can," I said calmly, showing the camera a series of checks. Every time a car was towed, half the fee went to a company called Urban Solutions. Guess who owns that company? I paused for dramatic effect. Margaret Whitmore and Tom Peterson. More neighbors started to emerge, drawn by the commotion. Mrs. Chen, from number 42, stepped forward, tears welling in her eyes. "They towed my son's car on Christmas Eve," she said into the microphone. "We had to pay $400 to get it back." That opened the floodgates. One by one, neighbors shared their stories. The Martinez family, who had lost their work van, the Patels, whose daughter's first car had been towed during her college graduation party. Each story perfectly matched a payment in our documents. The HOA president finally emerged from her house, designer sunglasses shielding her eyes. "This is all a misunderstanding," she announced, trying to project an air of confidence. "As HOA president, I have a duty to maintain property values. By stealing from your neighbors," I asked, loud enough for everyone to hear. I held up a final document, a list of property sales. Interesting how many homes were sold at below-market rates after their owners were hit with towing fees they couldn't pay. Even more interesting, how many of those homes were bought by shell companies connected to you and Tom. The crowd grew silent. The HOA president's sunglasses couldn't hide the beads of sweat forming on her forehead. Tom had retreated back into his house. But I wasn't finished. "I have one more thing to share," I said, pulling out my phone. On the screen was the security video from my garage, showing the HOA president herself directing the tow truck to my bike at 6 a.m. The timestamp clearly showed it was before the 48-hour notice period had expired. As cameras rolled and neighbors watched, the HOA president finally cracked. "Fine," she screamed. "You people deserve it, with your tacky cars and motorcycles ruining our prestigious community." A police car pulled up quietly behind the news vans. 2 officers stepped out, holding papers. I recognized them. They weren't just any officers. They were members of the motorcycle club who'd joined our rally. As they approached the HOA president with search warrants, I turned back to the cameras. "This isn't just about a motorcycle anymore," I said, my voice resonating with conviction. "It's about standing up to people who abuse their power. And it's about bringing a community together." Behind me, neighbors were already hugging, sharing stories, the years of fear and suspicion melting away like ice in the Arizona sun. The HOA president's house of cards had finally collapsed. The morning of the emergency HOA meeting, I found a brown envelope on my doorstep. Inside were photographs of the HOA president and Tom at their secret monthly dinners with the towing company owners, along with receipts showing they'd been selling impounded vehicles without proper notice. My neighbor, Jimmy, who worked at Peterson's Towing, had finally mustered the courage to expose everything. The community center was packed like never before. People were standing in the hallways, some even peering through the windows. As I walked to the front, the HOA president tried to initiate her usual monotonous meeting routine, but this time was different. I held up my phone, displaying the security video of my bike being towed. "Before we begin," I said calmly, "I think we need to discuss where all our towing fees are really going." The HOA president's face turned crimson as I projected the dinner photos onto the large screen. Tom leaped to his feet, shouting about privacy violations. But no one was listening to him anymore. One by one, neighbors stood up to share their stories. Mrs. Garcia's son's bicycle, Mr. Thompson's restored Mustang, even old Mrs. Chen's gardening equipment, all mysteriously towed and sold without warning. Then came the grand finale. Our forensic accountant, Mr. Roberts, entered the room, pushing a cart loaded with 3 boxes of documents. "Over the past 5 years," he announced, his voice booming through the room, "Margaret Whitmore and Tom Peterson have collected over $200,000 in unauthorized fees from our neighborhood." The room erupted in a cacophony of angry shouts. The HOA president tried to grab her designer handbag and flee, but 2 police officers were already waiting at the door. I raised my hand for silence. As your neighbor and as CEO of Harley-Davidson, I paused for effect, letting the words sink in. I have a different vision for our community. The room fell silent. I unveiled plans for a new community program. Free motorcycle safety courses for residents, a scholarship fund for aspiring young mechanics, and a monthly neighborhood bike show to foster camaraderie and connection. "This neighborhood doesn't need rigid rules and clandestine deals," I declared. "It needs community." The vote to remove the HOA president and Tom was unanimous. As they were escorted out in handcuffs, I noticed something remarkable. People were smiling, engaging in conversations with neighbors they'd never spoken to before. Mrs. Chen offered to teach gardening classes. Mr. Thompson volunteered his garage for basic car maintenance workshops. The Garcia kids began planning a bicycle repair club. Today, our neighborhood is transformed. The community center parking lot hosts motorcycle safety courses every weekend. Local kids learn about engines in our new workshop program. Even some of the former HOA board members are now proud motorcycle owners, their bikes properly parked, of course. Last week, I received a letter from the HOA president's new neighborhood across town. She was complaining about motorcycle noise and soliciting support. I sent back a Harley-Davidson catalog with a simple note. Bikes still available at employee discount, CEO. Sometimes, the sweetest revenge isn't simply winning. It's building something better, something stronger, from the wreckage of what your enemies tried to destroy. 6 months after the HOA president's departure, I received an unexpected email that made my morning coffee taste even sweeter. A neighborhood association from across town reached out, saying they'd heard about our story. Their HOA president, another Margaret type named Susan, had been pulling the same stunt with a different towing company. They wanted my help to fight back. I invited them to our newly renovated community center, where the walls now displayed photographs celebrating our neighborhood's transformation. The room was packed as I shared our story, but the real surprise came when Tom Peterson's son stepped forward, fighting back tears. He revealed a folder of documents proving his father and the HOA president had been running similar schemes in 3 other neighborhoods. The next day, I called an emergency meeting of Harley-Davidson's board. We decided to launch the Ride-Free Live Fair initiative, creating a legal defense fund for homeowners facing HOA harassment nationwide. Our neighborhood became the pilot program, with our community center serving as the headquarters. But the biggest shock came when we discovered the HOA president hadn't actually moved away. She'd simply shifted her operation to a retirement community in Florida. A resident there, a retired judge named Bill, recognized her from our viral news story and reached out. Within days, our legal team was helping them build a case. I got to personally deliver the news to our community during our first annual Neighborhood Unity Ride. Seeing hundreds of residents, from kids on bicycles to grandparents on trikes, parading through streets that the HOA president once ruled with fear, it felt like everything had come full circle. The old storage shed, where the HOA president used to hold her secret HOA meetings, we transformed it into a free motorcycle maintenance workshop for local youth. Every Saturday, I teach alongside former gang members who've become certified Harley mechanics, showing kids that there's more than one path to becoming part of a community. Last week, I received a call from a national news network wanting to do a feature story about how one towed motorcycle sparked a nationwide movement against HOA abuse. As I hung up the phone, I noticed a familiar tow truck driving past my house, but this time it bore a new logo. Community First Towing, protecting neighborhoods, not profits. Looking at my Harley gleaming in the driveway, I couldn't help but smile. The HOA president's illegal towing scheme hadn't just taken my bike. It had fundamentally shifted my perspective on what leadership truly means. Sometimes, the most profound changes begin with the smallest injustices, and the best revenge isn't about getting even. It's about making sure nobody else has to endure what you did. This story teaches us that seemingly small acts of injustice, when left unchecked, can escalate into widespread corruption. It highlights the importance of community vigilance and the power of standing up for what's right, even when facing seemingly insurmountable odds. It also demonstrates that true leadership comes not from wielding power, but from empowering others. What are your thoughts on this story? Have you ever experienced anything similar with an HOA or other authority figure? Share your experiences and insights in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more stories and discussions.